All right, today we're going to talk about industrialization following the Civil War. So in 1900, the US was the leading industrial power. We had raw materials, we had a strong labor supply, capital was plentiful, we had new labor-saving technologies, businesses benefited from government policies that protected business, and we had talented entrepreneurs. As for railroads, trunk lines were major routes between large cities. Eastern railroads were consolidated into trunk lines. And then Commodore Cornelius Vanderbilt was a steamboat businessman who turned into merging local railroads, and he helped to set standards for excellence and efficiency. Fun fact, Vanderbilt married his first cousin, had 13 children, built Grand Central Station in New York, and started Vanderbilt University. Western railroads led the way to settlement of the West, where the federal government provided railroad companies with huge subsidies in the form of loans and grants. Negative consequences led to hasty and poor construction and a lot of corruption. The Transcontinental Railroad was completed on May 10th at Promontory Point, Utah in 1869. It linked the Atlantic and Pacific states by railroad. By 1883, 3 other transcontinental railroads were completed. And then in 1893, there was the Great Northern Railroad, which connected St. Paul, Minnesota to Seattle. This is an image depicting the Promontory Point meeting place in Utah. Speculators, these are people who came into a business for a quick profit and made millions by selling off assets and watering stock. The railroads competed with speculators by offering rebates and kickbacks to favored shippers while charging high rates to smaller customers like the farmers. This led to a financial panic in 1893, forced a quarter of all railroads into bankruptcy, and then J.P. Morgan and other bankers quickly moved in to take control and consolidate them. So by 1900, nearly 2/3 of the nation's railroads were controlled by 7 giant systems. This led to the rail system becoming more efficient, but it was controlled by few powerful men like J.P. Morgan, which you see pictured on the left. And there were regional railroad monopolies as well. As for the steel industry, Henry Bessemer of England and William Henry in the US discovered that blasting air through molten iron produces high-quality steel. So the Great Lakes region became the center of steel production due to a higher accessibility to coal and iron ore. Andrew Carnegie, he started manufacturing steel in Pittsburgh in the 1870s. His business strategy was vertical integration, where a company would control every stage of the industrial process from the bottom level of mining all the way up to transporting the finished product. By 1900, Carnegie Steel employed 20,000 workers and produced more steel than all of the mills in Britain. So Carnegie emigrated from Scotland to the US, and his first job was actually working in a factory for $1.20 a day. So he really represented the American dream. The Steelers of Pittsburgh, they copied the Steel Mark logo. The yellow represents iron ore, red represents coal, and blue represents steel scrap. So that's why the Steelers logo looks the way it does. So U.S. Steel Corporation, Carnegie sold his company in 1900 for more than $400 million back then to a new steel combination headed by J.P. Morgan. It was the first billion-dollar company, and it was the largest enterprise in the world, employing 168,000 people and controlling more than 3/5 of the nation's steel business. As for the oil industry, the first oil well in the U.S. was drilled by Edwin Drake in Pennsylvania. Standard Oil was owned by John D. Rockefeller. By 1881, he controlled 90% of the oil refinery business. He practiced horizontal integration, where he bought out as many competitors as possible to form one giant monopoly. When he retired, Rockefeller's fortune was worth $900 million back then. Now we have an antitrust movement because middle-class citizens were afraid of trust's unchecked power. The urban elites also resented the increasing influence of the new rich. So the Sherman Antitrust Act was too vaguely worded, but it did prohibit any contract combination in the form of trust or otherwise. Then in the Supreme Court case, U.S. v. E.C. Knight Co. ruled that Sherman Antitrust Act could be applied only to commerce, not to manufacturing. So it basically led to very few convictions, really kind of toothless. As for conservative economic theories, Adam Smith wrote The Wealth of Nations and argued that business should be regulated not by the government, but by the invisible hand of the laws of supply and demand. It basically was laissez-faire economics, where government is hands off. Then social Darwinism came in, where Darwin's ideas of natural selection and survival of the fittest could be applied to the marketplace. There was a focus on concentrating wealth in the hands of the fit, and that helping the poor was misguided because it interfered with the laws of nature. It gave, quote, scientific, sanction for racial intolerance, basically. The gospel of wealth also justified the wealth of successful industrialists. Rockefeller said, "God gave me my riches." And Carnegie said that the wealthy had been given a God-given responsibility to carry out projects of civic philanthropy for the benefit of society. Rockefeller founded the University of Chicago and Rockefeller University. Carnegie distributed more than $350 million of his fortune to support the building of libraries, universities, and various public institutions. He founded over 3,000 libraries, and he also founded Carnegie University. He also built Carnegie Hall in New York City. As for inventions during this time period, we have the workable telegraph, invented by Samuel Morse in 1844. We have improved transatlantic cable by Cyrus Field in 1866, making it easier to send message across the sea in minutes. The typewriter was invented in 1867. The telephone was invented by Alexander Graham Bell in 1876. Cash register in 1879. Calculating machine, 1887. Adding machine, 1888. Kodak camera in 1888 as well. Fountain pen, created in 1884, so you don't have to dip a quill in ink anymore. Safety razor and blade, 1895. Thomas Edison's first invention was a machine for recording votes, and then he established a research lab in Menlo Park, New Jersey, which introduced the concept of mechanics and engineers working on a project as a team rather than as single inventors. So this was Edison's phonograph, where mechanical recording and reproduction of sound could happen. Edison's incandescent lamp, which was the first practical electric light bulb. Edison's dynamo generated electric power. His mimeograph machine was a stencil duplicator. His early motion picture camera. George Westinghouse held more than 400 patents, like for air brakes for railroads, and a transformer for producing high voltage alternating current, which made possible the lighting of cities and just generally the operation of anything electric. And then marketing of consumer goods, R.H. Macy in New York and Marshall Field in Chicago created department stores for cities. Frank Woolworth created the 5 and 10 cent store, which were chain stores. Sears and Roebuck, Montgomery Ward, they started as mail order catalogs, and they used the railroads to ship to rural customers everywhere. We now have packaged foods from Kellogg and Post, and refrigerated railroad cars, and canning, meaning food can last longer and for further distances. But there was a strong concentration of wealth. In the 1890s, the richest 10% of the US population controlled 90% of the nation's wealth. And this new class of millionaires flaunted their wealth by living in large mansions, having huge yachts, and throwing very lavish parties. Horatio Alger, he was a novelist who wrote every novel portraying a young man of modest means who then becomes wealthy through honesty, hard work, and a little luck. In reality, it's a myth. There was a widening gap between the rich and the poor and limited opportunities for upward mobility. The middle class was expanding during this time period. We have white-collar workers who are salaried workers whose jobs do not generally involve manual labor. Middle management now coordinated operations. Industrialization fueled the growth of the middle class by creating jobs for accountants, clerical workers, salespeople. We now have professionals like doctors and lawyers and public employees and storekeepers. By 1900, 2/3 of all Americans worked for wages, usually for 10 hours a day, 6 days a week. And these were usually determined by supply and demand. A usually steady supply of immigrants competing for factory jobs. Wages were barely above a level for basic living. Low wages were justified by arguing that raising wages would increase the working population, and the availability of more workers would then cause wages to fall, creating this cycle of misery and starvation. So working families started to rely on the incomes of women and children during this time as well. 1/5 of women in 1900 was in the labor force, working for wages. Only 5% of married women worked outside the home, and the women's role was in the home raising children. Nothing new there. Women usually worked in textile, garment, and food processing industries. They were seen as an extension of the home. They would also work as clerical workers like secretaries, bookkeepers, typists, telephone operators. Professions that became feminized usually lost their status and received lower wages and salaries than, quote, men's jobs. Before the Industrial Revolution, workers labored in small workplaces that valued an artisan's skills. They often felt a sense of accomplishment in creating a product from start to finish, but factory work was very, very different. Industrial workers were often assigned just one step in the manufacturing of a product. Working conditions were often really dangerous. Workers also rebelled against intolerable working conditions by either missing work or quitting. The average worker changed jobs every 3 years, and about 20% eventually dropped out of the industrial workforce instead of continuing because it was just so bad. As for industrial warfare, management held most of the power because strikers could easily be replaced by bringing in strike breakers known as scabs. Tactics for defeating unions included lockout, which was closing a factory to break a labor movement, blacklisting, where the names of pro-union workers would circulate among employers, yellow dog contracts, were workers being told as a condition for employment that they had to sign an agreement not to join a union. Private guards and state militias put down strikes, and court injunctions against strikes were also used. Management also fostered a public fear of unions as anarchists and un-American. Labor was divided on the best methods for fighting management. Some were for political action, others were for direct confrontation, like the strikes, the picketing, the boycotts, the slowdowns. In the Great Railroad Strike of 1877, it occurred during an economic depression, and railroad companies cut wages in order to reduce costs. This strike essentially spread across 11 states, shut down 2/3 of the country's railroads. For the first time since the 1830s, a president, Rutherford B. Hayes, had to send in federal troops to end the violence. More than 100 people were killed, and after the strike, employers addressed workers' grievances by improving wages and working conditions, while others took a hard line by busting up the organizations. So this is an image depicting the Great Railroad Strike of 1877. The National Labor Union was founded in 1866. They had skilled and unskilled laborers, agricultural and industrial workers. They focused on higher wages, an 8-hour day, equal rights, monetary reform, and worker co-ops. They want an 8-hour day for workers that were employed by the federal government, but they lost a lot of their support after the Depression and unsuccessful strikes. The Knights of Labor began as a secret society in order to avoid detection by employers. Membership was open to all workers, including African Americans and women. They wanted worker co-ops to make each man his own employer. They wanted to get rid of child labor. They wanted to get rid of trusts and monopolies. They favored cooperation and arbitration, so talking it out instead of strikes. The Haymarket bombing happened in Chicago in 1886. The May Day labor movement, 80,000 Knights of Labor wanted to strike for an 8-hour workday. 200 anarchists also joined and advocated the violent overthrow of the government. On May 4th, workers held a public meeting at Chicago's McCormick Harvester plant, and police attempted to break up the meeting. But then a bomb was thrown, and 7 police officers were killed. The bomb thrower was never found. 8 anarchist leaders were tried for the crime, and 7 were sentenced to death. Horrified by the bombing incident, many Americans concluded that the union movement was really violent and radical. The American Federation of Labor, this was an association of craft unions and focused on higher wages and improved working conditions. And Gompers directed his local unions of skilled workers to walk out until the employer agreed to negotiate a new contract through collective bargaining. At the Homestead Strike in 1892, this was at Carnegie's Homestead Steel Plant near Pittsburgh. They cut wages by nearly 20%, and they used lockout, private guards, and strike breakers to defeat the steelworkers' walkout after 5 months. This failure basically set back the union movement until the 1930s. Then the Pullman Strike. Pullman manufactured railroad sleeping cars known as Pullman cars. They announced a general wage cut and fired leaders of the workers' delegation who came to bargain with them. So basically they were told, don't handle any trains with Pullman cars, which tied up railroad transportation across the country. The railroad owners supported Pullman by linking Pullman cars to mail trails, which had to be gone. So President Grover Cleveland used the Army to keep the mail trains running. The Supreme Court got involved, and the Supreme Court approved the use of court injunctions against strikes, which gave employers a powerful weapon to break unions up. So regional differences, the Gilded Age industrial growth was concentrated in the Northeast and Midwest, largely because they had the biggest populations, the most money, the best transportation. These areas grew more cities and attracted more immigrants and migrants from rural areas and created more middle-class jobs.